Thank you very much. Good evening. It's a tremendous honour and pleasure to be lecturing in this wonderful space, and thank you so much for coming to listen. At the heart of my lecture this evening are some seeming paradoxes. We can glimpse something of the nature of these paradoxes by going back for a moment to mid-Victorian London. At that time, celebration of Magna Carta was built into the very fabric of the capital. In 1851, for instance, an original copy of Magna Carta was put on display at the Great Exhibition at Crystal Palace. Figures of the barons who confronted King John at Runnymede were carefully inserted on the facade of the new Houses of Parliament built in the 1840s and 50s, while in the 1860s, and very fittingly, given London's prominent role in securing Magna Carta, the home of the city's Lord Mayor, Mansion House, was given a special Magna Carta window. Yet for all this commemoration and celebration, one observer at the time made a comment that could equally well apply today. Magna Carta is on everybody's lips, he wrote in 1848, but in nobody's hands, and it is generally talked of in utter ignorance of its contents. In other words, while Magna Carta has frequently been celebrated and is incontestably one of the most iconic texts, not just in British history, but in global history, it has frequently been very little read, and understandings of its meanings and significance have proved extremely variable. Tonight, I want to explore these paradoxes. And I want to begin by drawing some parallels between Magna Carta and another iconic document that often goes unread and is misunderstood, namely the Federal Constitution of the United States. Both of these texts, the 1215 version of Magna Carta and the original US Federal Constitution, are roughly the same length. Magna Carta is made up of about 4,000 words. Not counting amendments, the US Constitution contains 4,400 words. Both documents were originally inscribed on parchment, a material made out of animal skin. Though Magna Carta was written in medieval Latin, not English, and with a primitive ink made out of dust, water, and powdered oak apple. Magna Carta and the US Constitution are also alike in being both products of armed struggle and civil war. In 1787, the Founding Fathers were seeking to construct a new and acceptable form of government for American territories that had previously formed part of the British Empire, and where most white inhabitants before the American Revolution had considered themselves to be British. Magna Carta, too, was a byproduct of violence and civil war. King John, who inherited the English throne in 1199, was not, as one Victorian historian described him, polluted with every crime that could disgrace a man. But he was certainly aggressive, contentious, personally unstable, and unlucky. During his reign, John lost important dynastic lands in France. He invaded Wales. The Pope excommunicated him, and he faced major baronial rebellions. The document that came to be styled Magna Carta, sealed at Runnymede on June the 15th, 1215, was more an attempted peace treaty between John and some of his opponents than an abstract rendition of laws and rights. As As a peace treaty, Magna Carta was a failure. Neither the king nor his rebellious barons tried very hard to implement its provisions, and had John not died late in 1216, the charter might have been lost or at least become much diminished. As it was, Magna Carta endured, but its subsequent history proved a volatile one. And this is something else it has in common with the US Constitution. The treatment and significance of both of these documents have changed substantially and sometimes surprisingly over time. Today, the original manuscript of the Federal Constitution is enshrined and on view in the rotunda of the United States National Archive in Washington, where millions of visitors from all over the world come to gaze at it. But this level of public display only became the norm from the 1950s. Before then, the original text of the American Constitution had a precarious existence and was kept largely out of sight. At different stages, it was stored in a grist mill in Virginia, kept in a tin box in various official basements, and finally stored in Fort Knox. Since Magna Carta is so much older, the fortunes of its original manuscript versions have been still more uneven. The Guildhall, as we've been told, possesses a superb 1297 copy of Magna Carta. But most of the copies that were produced in 1215 have disappeared. Those few that remain are very lucky indeed to survive. The British Library holds, I believe, 2 original 1215 copies of Magna Carta. One of these was supposedly discovered in the 1620s in a London tailor's shop. The tailor was about to cut the charter into multiple strips to serve as measures and padding for garments that he was making. But it's not simply as an object and as an artifact that Magna Carta has undergone dramatic changes over time. Its political and legal significance, too, has been uneven and volatile. To be sure, on King John's death in 1216, Magna Carta was rescued from possible marginality by being revived as a coronation charter for his child's successor, Henry III. A subsequent revision and revival of the charter during this reign in 1225 gave rise to what became the standard text. And in 1297, this version of Magna Carta, the version that the Guildhall has, was reissued by Edward I, entered into the official statute rolls, and ordered to be read out loud twice a year in every cathedral church. Nonetheless, even among England's legal profession, the impact of Magna Carta seems to have remained circumscribed up to the beginning of the 17th century. The document's popular impact in what for a long time remained, of course, a largely illiterate society was naturally even more limited. The London tailor, who is supposed to have been on the verge of slicing up an original manuscript copy of Magna Carta in the early 1620s, may have been able to read English because artisans and minor tradesmen of his sort in London often were literate by the early 17th century. But the grubby document in his hands would have been quite inaccessible to this man, written as it was in a particularly challenging, abbreviated form of medieval Latin. Even the term Magna Carta, or Magna Charta as it was often known, might have meant little or nothing to him. For while printed English translations of Magna Carta, expounding on its significance, were available by this time, the start of the 17th century, such publications would have been far beyond the pocket of a mere minor tradesman. So, what was it that led to the rise in the reputation and resonance of Magna Carta from the early 17th century? In the rest of this lecture, I'm going to focus on three of the instrumental factors involved. First, I want to stress the significance of Magna Carta being a discrete text that lent itself to increasing dissemination by print. Second, I want to look at the multivalence of Magna Carta, its vital capacity to cater to very different political groupings and causes. Finally, I want to say something more about the shifts that have occurred in perceptions of Magna Carta over time and in our own time. Now, it's usually Magna Carta's provisions that are focused on, its content. But no less significant as far as its impact has been concerned has been its nature as a material object, the fact that this is a text. As a relatively brief text made out of words, Magna Carta was easily portable. It could be translated in due course into any written language. And as print culture began to take off in Britain and elsewhere, so too did Magna Carta's potential reach and audience. The fact that most of its provisions were highly specific and time-bound, more than half of its original clauses address early 13th century fiscal grievances, actually proved an advantage in this respect, which you might not anticipate. But it meant that subsequent publishers, printers, and commentators, instead of having to reproduce and discuss the entirety of Magna Carta, could focus instead on select parts of the document, and especially on what came to be known as the Golden Passage, clauses 39 and 40. No free man will be taken or imprisoned, or outlawed or exiled, or in any way ruined, nor shall we go or send against him, save by the lawful judgment of his peers and by the law of the land. To no one shall we sell, to no one shall we deny or delay right or justice. Some indications of the growing interest in Magna Carta from the 17th century, and a measure of how its influence was nurtured by the spread of print, can be found in the development of British newspapers. According to one index of them, about 30 brief articles appeared on Magna Carta in English newspapers during the first half of the 18th century. But as more and more press outlets emerged, and as newspapers spread into Scotland, Ireland, and Wales, Magna Carta began receiving increasing coverage. In the second half of the 18th century, over 450 short articles seem to have been devoted to it. Between 1800 and 1849, the index reveals some 4,000 articles in the British press about Magna Carta. While during the second half of the 19th century, when newspapers here really began exploding in number and becoming far cheaper, over 13,500 articles were published in the UK mentioning Magna Carta. And it wasn't just newspapers that spread and bore witness to an expanding cult of Magna Carta, so increasingly did books and pamphlets, and for different kinds of readers. On the one hand, as we shall see, from the early 17th century, a succession of legal experts and scholars, notably Sir Edward Coke and William Blackstone, incorporated the text and interpretations of Magna Carta in learned works, which then in some cases went on to serve as manuals for generations of lawyers, home civil servants, and colonial administrators. From the outbreak of the English Civil War in the 1640s, there were also more efforts to bring Magna Carta to a wider audience by way of cheap pamphlets and broadsheets. In 1647, for instance, if you lived in London, you could purchase The Marrow and Soul of Magna Carta, price 1 shilling, 5 pence, put together by John Lilburne, a radical London-based activist who also influenced the Levellers' attempts at this time to draft a new written constitution. As the number of schools for middle-class children expanded from the 18th century onwards, Magna Carta was also incorporated into the course book market. In 1789, a publisher in Blackfriars issued The Cornerstone of the British Constitution, or the golden passage in the Great Charter of England called Magna Carta, a pithy title, aimed explicitly at the youth of both sexes. This pamphlet could be purchased in bulk for schools, with a dozen copies going for 1 shilling and 6pence, that's about 7p, and 9 shillings, that's just under 50p, securing you 100 copies. The interface between Magna Carta and print was also crucial to its influence overseas. From the late 17th century, London became one of the world's great centres and transmitters of print. Oxford, Cambridge, Dublin, and Edinburgh were also significant centres of printing and publishing. Books and other printed material to do with Magna Carta were increasingly dispatched from all of these cities to different parts of the world, something that became even easier in the 19th century with the development of the steam transport and the growth of English as a truly global language. But Magna Carta's increasing transcontinental influence was also massively assisted by British imperialism. At one level, many emigrants and administrators from these islands took knowledge and a cult of Magna Carta with them when they left for colonial sites. At another level, as the British Empire expanded, so too did the reach of the common law. And wherever the common law spread in the world, so did information about Magna Carta by way of the printed statutes and the legal writings of men like Coke and Blackstone. A cult of Magna Carta also spread in the empire, and indeed well beyond the empire, because agents of the British state took very good care that it should spread. A conspicuous example of this kind of official sponsorship occurred in the World Fair in New York in 1939. With war with Germany evidently on the horizon and desperate to foster a US military alliance, the Foreign Office and the British Council arranged for an original copy of Magna Carta to be displayed in a special Hall of Democracy in the British Pantheon, as it was called, at the New York Fair, where some 14 million visitors to the fair lined up to see it. At the same time, British officials arranged for the distribution of a free modern translation of Magna Carta to every US school that wanted one, a deliberate connection of this country with law and liberty so as to appeal to American sentiment. Yet for all its talismanic value at intervals to agents of the British state, Magna Carta has always given rise to multiple, sometimes subversive interpretation. And I think it's this hybridity, which we often forget, that helps to explain its continuing reputation. Lots of different kinds of people and lobbies can use Magna Carta. In part, this is due to the malleability of some of its language. When the original drafters of the Magna Carta in 1215, whoever they were, referred in Latin in various clauses to free man and free men, they were not intending any gestures to democracy. They used the term free men to distinguish the subjects of their benevolence from the vast majority of English men and women who were villeins, that is, unfree peasants, people for whom Magna Carta offered very little in 1215. But in subsequent centuries, and increasingly across the globe, Magna Carta's references to free men were increasingly interpreted in a wide, modern, democratic sense, as precious guarantees of liberty to everyone. As well as some of its language changing meaning over time, Magna Carta has also often been read deliberately against the grain. Consider the interpretation offered by one Helena Florence Normanton in a pamphlet called Magna Carta and Women, published in 1915, the 700th anniversary of the Charter. Normanton was clever, ambitious, and radical, the child of a London piano maker, the first woman to practice as a barrister in England, and a staunch advocate of women's suffrage and of Indian independence. She really does deserve a biography, I think. She also had her own style of textual and historical analysis, taking off from the undoubted fact that versions of Magna Carta had made specific provisions for affluent widows. Normanton offered a feminist spin on the text as a whole. The list of women whom King John wronged is a long one, she argued. It begins with his wife. Consequently, she reasoned, it was almost impossible to conjecture that English women did not play a part in forming the state of public opinion which resulted in the extortion of Magna Carta from John. She also argued, as some had done before, that the Latin word homo, meaning man, was to be understood in some sections of Magna Carta as also embracing women. And this led her to a reinterpretation of the so-called Golden Passage. This had declared, you'll remember, that no free man was to be outlawed or exiled, saved by the judgment of his peers. Yet, without any judgment by their peers, Normanton reminded her readers in 1915, women in Britain were still being excluded from the vote, and therefore, in effect, being exiled from their own polity and shut off from its law. Women's unenfranchisement and exclusion from juries was thus, in short, a clear violation of the terms of Magna Carta and therefore unpatriotic. Normanton's feminist reinterpretation of Magna Carta is just one particularly adroit example of what has been a recurrent trend, the exploitation of this document by multiple, often wildly divergent groupings and lobbies. The fact that Magna Carta often went unread and was anyway a relatively brief document that left a lot of things out only made such multiple interpretations even easier. What religion was Magna Carta, for instance? For many 17th, 18th, 19th and early 20th century Britons, the answer was clear. The Charter was manifestly part of a Protestant heritage of liberty. Just like Americans, Britons were a people of the book, of the word, and King John's Magna Carta was the political and legal counterpart, as it were, of King James' Bible. It was the Bible of the British Constitution, wrote one Anglican bishop in 1915, repeating a claim originally made by Lord Chatham. Our oldest reformation, the bishop insisted, was that of Magna Carta. Yet, of course, the men of 1215 had actually all been Catholics. And the fact that Magna Carta was an achievement of Catholics was frequently pointed to in the late 18th century and in the 19th century by those wanting to emancipate Catholics in Ireland and by those wanting to counter Protestant prejudices against the supposed unfreedom of Rome. Then again, what exactly was Magna Carta's nationality? Some of the leading actors in 1215 had been French or Norman by origin, and it's very likely that some of these individuals at least could not speak English. Subsequently, to be sure, many commentators came to treat Magna Carta as an text of Englishness, an epoch which we have a right to consider the commencement of our nationality, as one English constitutional scholar wrote in 1848. But as Edmund Burke pointed out, Magna Carta was swiftly extended to Ireland, and so could be viewed as a safeguard of Irish liberties too. The growing scale of Britain's overseas empire meant that Americans, Australians, New Zealanders, South Africans and Indians too, plus the inhabitants of many other countries, could also stake some kind of claim to Magna Carta and view it as, in some way, theirs. Increasingly, indeed, Magna Carta came to function as a metaphor, a trademark for charters of liberties or rights anywhere. Thus, the Treaty of Waitangi in 1840, which was supposed to protect the interests of New Zealand's indigenous peoples, quickly came to be known as the Maori Magna Carta. This trend of using Magna Carta as a metaphor and trademark has continued, and not just in Britain's one-time empire. In 2009, the President of the Philippines signed into law a so-called Magna Carta of Women, an attempt to provide for greater gender equality among Filipinos. Such co-options of Magna Carta's name and brand bear witness, of course, to its global reputation, but they can also empty it of specific local significance. And what about Magna Carta's politics? In Britain, it has been this question that has most given rise to conflicting interpretations of the Charter, especially since the early 1600s. As is well known, the struggles between Crown and Parliament in the 17th century served dramatically to redirect attention to Magna Carta and led to copious writings on and reinterpretations of its significance. Most durably, perhaps, Edward Coke, who was born in 1552, held a succession of high legal offices and in the 1620s became a leading House of Commons activist, compiled his four-part masterwork, Institutes of the Laws of England. The second volume of this especially heaped honorifics on Magna Carta, and Coke's Institutes went on to become one of the great foundation texts for the study of the common law on both sides of the Atlantic. In subsequent centuries, too, whenever there were marked struggles over the organisation and allocation of power in these islands, different partisan groupings almost invariably attempted to use Magna Carta as ammunition and in order to legitimise their respective political endeavours. Thus, in the 1760s, the great London radical and rake John Wilkes was careful to include an image of Magna Carta on the masthead of his newspaper, the Middlesex Journal or Chronicle of Liberty. But on the other hand, and at the same time, George III, the monarch whom John Wilkes sometimes attacked, was also careful to commission a portrait of himself gesturing in a proprietorial manner towards Magna Carta, a pose that many other aristocrats also adopt at this time. I mean, Magna Carta is just everybody's. It was again, in part, the brevity of Magna Carta, plus the fact that, again, most people don't read all of it or any of it, that allowed it to be so diversely interpreted and laid claim to. In addition, those referring to it often emphasize different aspects of the document to suit their particular political and ideological purposes. Among conventional patriots, Magna Carta's antiquity and stress on the supremacy of the law seem to offer yet more proof of national, sometimes English, sometimes British exceptionalism. When the German-born artist John Sebastian Miller published a print in London in 1780 called The Confirmation of Magna Carta, he proudly assured his adopted countrymen that it is this law that constitutes an Englishman, and as such thou art distinguished from all men on earth. For political conservatives like George III, however, the early medieval origins of Magna Carta could be useful in another way, as a demonstration that liberties in Britain had been a slow, gradual, and organic growth, and consequently that no sudden or drastic or radical changes were necessary or wise. Radicals and revolutionaries here and elsewhere, however, often read the lessons of Magna Carta completely differently. After all, in 1215, King John had not chosen of his own free will to agree to Magna Carta. He had been compelled to do so by force. Looked at this way, Magna Carta was a blatantly innovative and iconoclastic document, an act of revolution even. Consequently, when the great Norfolk-born radical Tom Paine published his mega bestseller, Common Sense, in Philadelphia in 1776, he urged the Americans to establish their freedom from Britain by means of writing a new Magna Carta. And if you look at some African and Indian nationalists in the 20th century campaigning against British rule, you can see similar appropriations of Magna Carta as a text of rebellion, a text of resistance. In Britain itself, many late 18th and 19th and 20th century radicals also genuflected to Magna Carta, though not invariably so. Some, like the great utilitarian philosopher and legal reformer Jeremy Bentham, argued that Magna Carta was simply too old a document and catered too much to national complacency to serve any useful modern purpose. The cult of Magna Carta, wrote Bentham, functioned as a camouflage for the harsh and inequitable realities of power in Britain. The aegis of liberty was held up to cover all and to dazzle the eyes of weak-sighted observers, he argued, a criticism that can retain some force today. Yet Bentham was actually wrong to suppose that modernity was bound to empty Magna Carta of all British significance. In at least one major respect, international developments after 1776 actually served to give Magna Carta increasing traction and currency here. From 1776 to 1780, 11 one-time American colonies drafted single-document state constitutions. These had an impact on the US federal constitution, which in turn influenced subsequent written constitutions in France, Switzerland, Haiti, the Iberian and Italian peninsulas, and many other places. By 1820, some 50 written constitutions were in being in continental Europe alone. 80 more constitutions were adopted between 1820 and 50, many of them in Latin America. And by 1914, these political devices, written constitutions, had spread to parts of Asia, Africa, and the Pacific world. Now, of course, in the early 21st century, written constitutions are almost universal. The United Kingdom, however, has remained conspicuously aloof from this otherwise global trend. And the absence here of a codified constitution helps, I would argue, to explain some of the continuing cult of Magna Carta. Very quickly, members of the British political class began to represent Magna Carta both as a pioneer version of a written constitution and as an adequate substitute for one. Between 1776 and 1800, for example, in other words, the self-same period when written constitutions first began to proliferate, the number of parliamentary allusions to Magna Carta by peers and MPs was 20 times higher than the total number of such references recorded at Westminster between 1761 and 1775. Magna Carta, declared one MP ringingly in 1808, was our constitution. More than that, some British commentators argued it was the example and precedent of Magna Carta that had helped other, less fortunate nations to develop their codified constitutions. It seems not too fanciful, wrote James Bryce, a Scots-Irish liberal politician and jurist in 1917, to say that the prelates and barons of Runnymede, building better than they knew, laid the foundation of that plan of written constitutions which has now covered the world from Peru to China. There's a wonderful audacity in this kind of argument when you think about it, that at one level, having Magna Carta means that Britain doesn't need a written constitution, but simultaneously, Magna Carta is encouraging written constitutions elsewhere. It's very neat. But those wanting to argue that in Magna Carta, Britain possessed a sort of precocious written constitution that both ruled out any need for the real thing at home and served as an incentive and model to those overseas, faced an obvious challenge. One of the under-acknowledged functions of successful written constitutions has always been to serve as a kind of soft power. Thus, political actors in the United States have persistently, since 1787, deployed and disseminated its written constitution so as to seek to spread American values abroad. Other countries acquiring written constitutions, France after 1789, for example, or post-independence India, have done much the same. Mass produce and export copies of their respective written constitutions so as to trumpet and seek to export their national values and political nostrums to others. But while British officials could and did trumpet the virtues of Magna Carta, the original document was itself manifestly too old and too brief to serve on its own as an adequate means to communicate British political values and systems overseas. And this, I am sure, helps to account for the marked surge in constitutional history writing that took place in Britain in the 19th and 20th centuries. Writing and publishing constitutional history, a phrase that was first popularized in the 1820s by an Englishman, served as a means to propagate, by way of print, Britain's political systems and values, not just at home, but also increasingly overseas. And this surge in constitutional history writing from the early 19th century onwards also helped to keep alive the flame of Magna Carta and to elaborate on and reinvent its significance. Today, it's easy to forget just how central the writing and study of constitutional history once was in Britain and its empire, not just in schools and universities, but outside them. Many of the great 19th century prime ministers, for example, such as Gladstone and Disraeli, wrote books and published books on the British Constitution. Works on the Constitution frequently became bestsellers that passed through multiple editions. Thus, the Oxford jurist A.V. Dicey's famous Introduction to the Study of the Law of the Constitution was published in 1885 and had reached its 9th edition by 1939. Potted versions of such texts were made widely available for schools and general use, while at the universities, constitutional history by the likes of Dicey, William Stubbs, F.W. Maitland, and Sir Frederick Pollock, and therefore instruction about Magna Carta, was for a long time an integral part of undergraduate legal and historical education. Since the 1970s, however, constitutional history has been in rapid decline. It's now hardly ever taught here in schools and universities. This has been the case in other countries too. But the disappearance of constitutional history poses particular challenges and problems, I think, here. The United Kingdom possesses no codified constitution that its citizens can read or download or consult in libraries. Although, as we've seen, Magna Carta possesses some resemblances to the US federal constitution, it is, in its legal and political significance, an utterly different kind of document. It is not a fundamental law. Indeed, all but 3 of Magna Carta's clauses have by now been repealed by Parliament. For a long time, as I say, a knowledge of these islands' constitutional history served in some respects, as a substitute for a written constitution here. Some familiarity with constitutional history at least supplied British citizens and British politicians with information about how their political system had evolved and how it was supposed to work. But now we do not even have that constitutional history. In these circumstances, with both a codified constitution lacking in the UK and with constitutional history barely taught or read here anymore, it is scarcely surprising that faith in Britain's political processes and an understanding of how they are supposed to operate are currently so uneven. Which brings me to my conclusion and to the question of how we might seek to celebrate Magna Carta in 2015, the document's 800th birthday. The crucial trick will surely be to strike a balance between undue cynicism on the one hand and undue complacency and mere retrospective celebration on the other. For all its antiquity and limitations, Magna Carta has been highly important as a symbol, as a constitutive story of identity, as a persistent component of political argument and claim-making, and as part of a discourse of rights, both here and in many other parts of the world. And Magna Carta retains legal power and charisma here. As an English judge argued in 2000, in brief, he said, Magna Carta means this, that the king is and shall be below the law. And this idea that the rule of law should be set securely above the vicissitudes and ambitions of the politically powerful remains a vital one, not least in a great financial centre like this. But in the light of some of the challenges confronting the UK at present, over devolution, over Europe, over reductions in legal aid, over human rights, and over the scale now of constitutional illiteracy here, commemoration of what has been achieved in the past is arguably insufficient. Perhaps we should use 2015 to think more widely for the future. The 700th anniversary of Magna Carta occurred in 1915 in the midst of the First World War. But these terrible circumstances did not prevent some of those writing about Magna Carta at that time from urging that it be looked at not simply as an episode in history, a famous legacy of the past, but also as an inspiration to future and further imaginative constitutional change and discussion. The framing of a new, perhaps federal constitution for the British Isles might surely be looked for, urged one Scottish academic writing on Magna Carta in 1915. So he thought might the framing of some stepping stone at least towards a scheme of government for Europe and the world, capable of substituting the decisions of justice and reason for the grim arbitration of war. Also writing in 1915, the feminist Helena Normanton advanced a similar forward-looking argument, but in a shorter, pithier form. The really enduring importance of Magna Carta, she urged, was that at its heart was an element of hope. Thank you very much.